Good morning and welcome to our special guest, Amber Finch. Amber is a partner and global chair of the Insurance Recovery Group at Reed Smith LLP. And today we will be discussing success at mediation, lessons from one lawyer's experience. What does it mean to succeed at mediation? Does it mean the same thing in every case or to every person? How do you plan for success? And how do you adjust your plan when the mediation swerves? When do you conclude that the mediation is not a success? And then what do you do? Amber Finch is well prepared and well equipped to discuss all these questions with us and more. Amber is chair of Reed Smith's Insurance Recovery Group and former managing partner of the firm's Los Angeles office. She will share her insights to help every lawyer and every mediator answer these questions and make every mediation a success. Amber joined Reed Smith in 2011, and since then she has become the go-to lawyer for creating effective risk management solutions. With her litigation background, she has helped her commercial policyholder clients recover hundreds of millions of dollars in insurance proceeds. Amber represents a litany of clients, from startup businesses to middle market and Fortune 500 companies. She helps companies manage risk by negotiating broader insurance coverage on the front end, negotiating insurance and indemnity provisions in deal contracts, assisting with tender and collection on insurance and indemnity claims, and litigating insurance and indemnity disputes. Amber has significant experience in standard first-party and third-party insurance policies, as well as specialty policies, emerging industries, and disruptive technologies. Most recently, Amber represents various companies in connection with business income interruption and property damage losses arising from the COVID-19 pandemic, and aviation businesses in connection with losses arising out of the Russia-Ukraine conflict. Amber, please tell us a little bit about the LA Regional Foodbank, to which you would like people to contribute if they're in a position to do so, and then on with the presentation. Amber Finch, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Jeff. I'm very, very delighted to be here today. It's a pleasure to be able to work with you and to talk with all of you this afternoon. The Los Angeles Regional Foodbank, as Jeff mentioned, it is one of the leading food banks in the Los Angeles County. I have had the pleasure of being a volunteer through my law firm with Food for the Bar. Every year, Reed Smith participates and brings a lot of our colleagues and even our family members to help support the efforts that the food bank does for our community. I've always used it as a lesson for my own small children when we've been able to bring them and to make sure that we're giving back. While we're talking here today, there will be a link that's posted in the chat. If you are able to contribute, we'd ask that you do it. Obviously, we would be grateful, as would the food bank, and of course, all of the recipients of the great work that they do. With that, let's get started. Let's talk about, my experience in successes at mediation. And those successes come in a lot of different ways. First, to kind of give you the lay of the land, as Jeff mentioned, I am the global chair of the Insurance Recovery Group here at Reed Smith. And in a sense, what that means is I'm a coverage lawyer. I represent policyholders. And so for myself, mediations actually come in two different types. Sometimes I'm in a mediation as coverage counsel against insurers directly in litigation. And in that instance, I'm usually the plaintiff in the case. Other times I experience mediations as coverage counsel in the underlying defense case when my client is actively being sued. And in that instance, I have my defense hat on. So I look at mediations differently depending on which situation I'm in. Sometimes success at mediation might be very different in either setting. Other times there are certain rules that apply no matter what your role is when you're there. So I kind of take the rule of there are really sort of 5 steps that I use for success in mediation. The first one is setting goals for yourself and your client. And what does that look like? Sometimes it's to settle the case. And that is the reason why we're at a mediation. Other times it's to get closer in negotiations. Perhaps we're in a stage in the litigation where it may not settle today, but if we can just kind of get in the range or get in the ballpark, as we call it, perhaps there might be an additional opportunity to get us closer after some major point in the litigation has come across. Sometimes it's just information gathering. And I think it's very important to know that that is a piece of mediation, and as a practitioner, that is okay if all you get at the end of the day of a mediation is just additional information. That could also be success, as that term is defined. So the first thing is, for yourself as the lawyer and representing your client, is understanding what are your goals. What do you think? After you've analyzed the issues, you're looking at all of the potential outcomes, you understand what the play is, what the defenses might be. As the lawyer, what are your goals? Understanding sort of from a 50,000-foot level. Of course, you're there not by yourself. You're there with your client. And so the other question is, what are the client's goals? Now, sometimes you're aligned, other times you're not. And so what do you do in those situations? If you think that the case is in a stage where this may not be the mediation where it settles, but you have a client who's adamant about settling, you need to talk that through with your client. Talk about why they have certain expectations. What are the goals? When do they expect those goals to be met? And then talk about how you can help them achieve those goals given the scenarios that you have before you. Once you've set your goals for both yourself as the lawyer as well as your client, the second issue or the second step is prepare, prepare, prepare. I can't say enough about that. And this is true no matter which hat you have on, whether you're in plaintiff's room or defendant's room, whether you are the client or the lawyer, whether you are trying to settle, trying to get closer, or just trying to get some information. In every scenario, preparation is key to success. What does that mean? Number one, generally speaking, when you go into a mediation, you're going to have some kind of a mediation brief prepared. Don't take lightly for that requirement. Some mediators may not want it at all. Others have specific requests of what that product should look like. But for your purposes, in terms of preparing, no matter what your ultimate mediator's brief work product looks like, you need to know what's going into that document. You need to know your facts cold. You need to understand the valuation of your case. And let's break that down. Valuation is in two stages. I always look at it. What is the exposure for your client? What is the exposure for the other side? And then there's the settlement valuation. Is this a case that can be resolved for less than, for example, what the ultimate exposure might be? I can't tell you how many times I've walked into a mediation as coverage counsel in an underlying case where I'm working with underlying counsel, where someone in the mediation is not prepared, whether it be the insurers, whether it be the plaintiffs in the underlying case, or in some instances where it's our own defense counsel. They haven't done the calculation. And in those instances, it makes it very difficult to really try and get the parties together to come to a resolution. You have to understand value when you walk into a mediation, and you have to ensure that your client understands the value as well. Mediation isn't a time for you to walk in and throw numbers in the air, hoping that they will stick. I always say, you've got a number, you need to back that up. Where are your receipts? How did you get to that number? And when you're thinking about settlement valuation, why are you asking for a discount on that? If it's a defense, if you're coming from a defense perspective, why are we at a low number when the plaintiffs are very high? Is it because the carriers aren't in the ballpark yet and you need to do your job to get them there? And if that's the case, what are the strategies to getting everyone aligned in those same the same value park? Without having done that homework, again, it makes it very difficult to come in to a mediation and define it as success. We have to do our homework. It's like a test. You walk in, most of us can't score 100% on an exam if you haven't studied ahead of time. And that's precisely what preparation does. I know it sounds, fundamental and doesn't need to be said, but we get busy as lawyers. And sometimes preparation can fall through the cracks. And so I say it and to repeat the importance of it because it may be the most important thing that you do ahead of the mediation. The third thing that I come into a mediation with is the thought process and mentality of negotiating in good faith. You heard me say it doesn't move the needle when all we're doing is walking in and throwing numbers out in the air. Negotiating in good faith is a requirement on both sides. If you're on the defense side of the house and you're throwing down lowball numbers, you're sending messages to the other side that you're not ready to succeed at this mediation. And on the flip side, if you're on the plaintiff's in the plaintiff's room and you're throwing out pie in the sky numbers, again, without receipts and no backup, you are sending a message to the other side that you're not ready to have success at the mediation. So if you're in those situations, what do you do and how do you get aligned with your clients? How do you get aligned with the folks on the other side of the room that you're not talking to? It's about communication. It's about looking at the goals that we set at the beginning of the day, taking a look at them, reassessing, making sure that you've done your homework with respect to valuation, and saying, notwithstanding what we think we ultimately might do at the end of the day, but here's what we're able to do today. We are here in good faith to negotiate. Now, what if you're in the room, you and your client believe that you are negotiating in good faith, and you believe perhaps the other side is not? Or alternatively, your client has expectations that perhaps aren't reasonable for today's purpose. What then? That's where tip number 4 comes in. Use the mediator. You're paying for that mediation. You're paying for the services of the mediator. Use that mediator. They are there for you as a resource. Sometimes it's, hey, mediator, I need you to talk to my client. Sometimes it's, hey, mediator, if we're going to get this deal done today, I need you to go to the other side and get them off of this number or this thought process or whatever it is. Arm the mediator with the facts and the leverage to be able to do it, the receipts, as I call it. But have that conversation. The mediator isn't just a hosting venue where you come in and you throw numbers back and forth. They're there to help you try and resolve your case. The best mediators, in my opinion, are the ones that are there with you arm in arm. They are there with the same goals that you all have. And if it's to settle that case, they are looking outside of the box to think about, what can we do in this instance? What are the lawyers in the case not thinking about? How can we be creative and try and get the parties closer together? We can't think of everything. Oftentimes as practitioners, we are set in our positions, right? If I am in a mediation against an insurer, I know I'm right. My client has paid a lot of money for premiums. An insurance company, it's your job to pay them now that they've had a loss. If I'm in an underlying case where my client's being sued, and as coverage counsel, my position is insurers, we've got a lot of exposure here. You need to get us out. And on the flip side, I've got the message being sent to me from the defense counsel. It's not covered. It's excluded. There is no insurance here. Or alternatively, you have, in an underlying case, you have not given me enough information to be able to evaluate the case and to be able to put any money or enough money on the table. Those are the kinds of issues that come across here. And that's when it's very important for your mediator to kind of understand the lay of the land and for you to help them help you. And finally, my last tip, number 5, and this is a big one: close the deal or walk away. At some point in the mediation, you're going to have to come to a conclusion in your mind and with your client as to where we're going to end up that day. Are we close enough that you realize this deal can be done? Or are we so far apart that there's no way that we can get a deal done here? Understand the dynamics of a mediation to know where along that line you are and your client is. As a practitioner, I have found that my mediations are most successful when I understand what the goals are of my client, what I have prepared, and so I know the strengths and weaknesses of my case and understand what my litigation strategy is all the way through trial. And I also know what the leverage points are. Using that piece of information, I know, usually by the noon hour, whether this is something that's going to go somewhere and we should still continue to try and let's go, or whether, you know what, it's not settling today. So let me go back and finish writing that summary judgment motion that I've got on my desk that I need to go file. For me, these 5 tips have helped me in a variety of different circumstances. I use them, like I say, in both settings, whether I'm coverage counsel in a coverage litigation against an insurer or whether I'm coverage counsel in an underlying defense case. But you've got to set the goals up front. You have to prepare. You need to go in with a mindset of negotiating in good faith. You must use your mediator. And you also have to understand whether we're going to get this done or whether we need to come back another day. And 5A, point 5A is if you decide that it can be done, but it may not be today, don't stop negotiating. That's when I go back to point number 4, and it's use your mediator. To me, it's very simple, 5 steps, but in actually putting them into action every single time you go to mediation is the difference between walking out of that room with a happy client and with an unhappy client. Even if we don't settle that day, I still want to make sure that my relationship with my client is preserved. And those 5 tips help me understand that and help me bridge that relationship gap with my clients. Those are my 5 tips, Jeff. Let's chat.
That's terrific, Amber. Those are wonderful tips and lots of food for thought here. I particularly like your emphasis on the happy client, because I just don't agree with that conventional wisdom that a successful mediation is one in which everybody leaves equally unhappy. Perhaps you think about it the same way I do, which is I've worked very hard in my career, went to a bunch of fancy schools and got degrees and worked very hard. And I'd hate to think that I put in all that effort to have my mission in my career to be making people unhappy, albeit in equal degrees. So let me ask you, what are some of the hallmarks of happiness in a client, given the other reality, which is that in virtually all settlements, the people who are paying money are paying more than they think they ought to be paying. The people who are getting money are getting less than they think in heavenly justice they ought to be getting, and yet they settle anyway. So what are the keys to happiness, given the almost inevitable disappointment with the financial term of the settlement?
Excellent question, Jeff. And I, like you, don't believe in that everybody walks away unhappy. Frankly, my clients are happy when we walk away from mediation, again, whether we settle or not. And I think it goes back to my point number 1 about setting those goals, both for yourself and your client. A lot of it is about managing expectations. Again, if the thought process is that you're going in and you're going to just throw numbers in the air and see if they stick, lowball numbers on the one end or pie in the sky numbers in the other end, and you don't have any backup or receipts for them, I think you set yourself up for unhappiness and an unhappy relationship with your client. On the other hand, you should be in a position to be able to have a conversation with your client and say, hey, look, I've done my homework. Here are the strengths and the weaknesses of our case. Here's the valuation of the ultimate exposure and all the way to trial. And here's where we are right now in the case. If it's pre-discovery and a lot of that fact information hasn't been developed yet, the other side may not understand why you have valued the exposure in the way that you have. If, on the other hand, you're in a position where you have summary judgment motions filed, all bets are off, and then it's a risk issue, right? There's economic factors that go in as well that you have to have communications with your clients. Some, are like, hey, it's more important for me to close my books on this issue than it is for me to get the most money in the world. And those are conversations that you have to have with your client so that you know what your job is when you walk in the room. Once you understand that, mediation is a gift because it allows you to get the success of the mediation that you have set up together with your client. And hopefully at the end of the day, as a coverage lawyer, I'm recovering. So whether I recover that day or the next day, even if it's not the ultimate number that I would have obtained at trial, my clients are still happy. Sometimes I get more than where we are. My clients are very happy. So it's all about just making sure that you're having that conversation with your clients ahead of time so that you know what the goal is, you've set that goal, and so that you can achieve it. And everybody's happy when they achieve that goal.
Well said. Let's follow up on the point regarding extreme versus reasonable opening demands and offers. What about the situation, you've probably found yourself in this situation, where you have a business client who's very sophisticated in their own business, but not so sophisticated in the world of litigation and not so sophisticated in the world of insurance litigation. Perhaps it's the first time they've been involved in a dispute with an insurance company or in a significant piece of litigation at all. And the client says to you, look, I know how these insurance carriers operate. They're going to lowball us. They're going to offer peanuts for the first hour, 2 hours of mediation. So we've got to start sky high to let them know that we're for real, we're tough, and also to protect you as the policyholder lawyer. You don't want to get a complaint at the end of the day that, gee, Amber, we got a disappointing result because we started at your reasonable number. If we had started where I wanted to start, we would have ended up doing better. What are some tips when you're on the policyholder side for dealing with those kinds of ticklish situations with clients?
Of course, that happens a lot. And it goes back to this issue of having receipts. To me, a pie in the sky number is not pie in the sky if I have receipts for it. And so from that perspective, doing my homework and having conversations with my client, when we look at valuation and where we are, those numbers we can back up. If they are above that, if it's, hey, let's stick it to them and let's add on or tack on just for purposes of, trying to start high, that's a conversation you need to have with the client. Ultimately, remember, it's their decision. It's not your number, it's their number. And where, if that's what the client wants to go in with, we go in with that. But I can't think of a time that I've been in a mediation where I've thrown out a number that didn't back up with receipts. And so from that perspective, I think every lawyer should be doing their homework on the valuation aspect, because even if it's a high number, and I have heard instances where if we're at that level, the insurance company on the other side will come back and say, well, those are numbers that those are the 100% success rate numbers that you would get after trial. Okay, but I can back them up. I can back that number up. And then you come in, you tell me where you are. But I don't think anyone should go in with this idea of being able to just throw numbers in and not being able to back them up. Because if that's the response that I'm getting from the carrier, I need to be in a position to tell the mediator why this number is so high. And once I arm the mediator with that information, I've done the math, here are the facts, here's how we got here, here's the interest calculation, here is what the law says on contracts and bad faith, etc. Here is my business interruption calculation that we've done. It's not a pie in the sky number anymore. It is here, your exposure is very high, and here's my damages. And if we have to go to trial, guess what? I'm getting Brandt fees, you're going to pay Reed Smith fees, and I'm not cheap. I'm very good at what I do, so my rate is high. So we can talk about this right now, or we can continue to litigate. But the goal is to just be able to back those numbers up, and don't be afraid.
So what about putting in demands for what we call the extra contractual remedies, bad faith, sometimes the Brandt fees, the legal fees? Those numbers can escalate a policyholder or plaintiff's demand exponentially, and they always have some inflammatory effect on the insurance carrier when you put them in. Sometimes they backfire, sometimes they're very effective. What's your thought on when to include those tort measures of damages, those potentially explosive measures of damages, which are possible to recover at trial, but they're certainly no sure bet?
So this is always a calculus that a coverage lawyer looks at. From my perspective, it depends on the case. It depends on the egregiousness of the behavior of the insurance companies. It depends on the jurisdiction that I'm in. In California, for example, I know I've got leverage with respect to tort fees and Brandt fees there. less so in some other jurisdictions who don't have that remedy, or the remedies are statutory and perhaps there's a little less teeth there. It's also about where you are in the litigation. You know, there might be situations where if we're at the beginning of the case and it's like, hey, if we can get this done and not spend a whole lot of money and not spend a whole lot of time arguing and litigating about this, that might be something we can discount. Alternatively, if we're at the stage of MSJ and, you know, and the next thing we're going to do if we don't get this settled is go into trial, it's a conversation that we are certainly having with our clients, and we can talk about what that means. I have had success in mediation in dealing with Brent fees. I don't think any coverage lawyer should take it off the table. It is a part of the overall damage assessment in your case. And especially in California, it is definitely a leverage. I know it, and the insurers know it as well. And so the question is, how are we going to do this? What's the approach? Where are we in the case? How egregious is the behavior? Have we created a factual record that would support those? All of that is part of the assessment that goes into whether or not you add it. This certainly isn't a situation where I say, all right, we're going to mediation, let's take that off the table first thing. No, it's part of the conversation. Flip side, it's also not every time I go into the mediation, and we have to add Brent fees as part of our negotiation. It is part of the conversation. It's part of the risk analysis that you do, and it's part of the conversation that you have with your client.
Right. Depending on the facts and circumstances, not only of each case, but of each client, their appetite for risk, their appetite for litigation, their ability to afford litigation, both financially and in terms of distraction from their business. I find the best lawyers on the policyholder side really do become trusted advisors and look not just at the strengths and weaknesses of claims and defenses, but also how the case and the controversy, the claim fits into the rest of the client's business and life and career. How do you, particularly the first time you're representing a client, what are some good ways to earn the trust of the client so that you can get this broader information about the client's business, career, and life, how this case fits in, so that you can give that more three-dimensional advice to the client?
That's a great question. That's something that, I strive to do in my practice, regardless of the type of matter that I'm working on, whether it's advice and counsel, whether it's litigation, whether we are going to mediation, or whether we're going to trial. I think it's important to humanize, especially when we're dealing with corporate clients, humanizing the entities that you are representing. And those entities speak from their people. What is how can you demonstrate to a jury? I always think about the jury every single stage of my case. How can you demonstrate to the jury what your client stands for? And having those conversations with your clients, breaking down and understanding and just having chit chat with them. How's business going? What are you all doing? Oh, by the way, I saw you were doing this community service benefit for this charity. That's such a wonderful thing. I saw you are doing XYZ over in the jurisdiction across the street from me. It's a conversation that you should be having with your clients to let them know that you care about their business, that you are there, you're in partnership with them, because your role as counsel is to ensure that the economic factors of the business are still moving and shaking, right? And so a part of that is being able to understand what they do on a day-to-day basis. So I always think about how I can create a relationship and not just a transaction with my clients. And the more that I have a relationship with the client, the better I am at explaining that to a jury, the better I am at explaining that to my adversary, the better I am at explaining that and making that presentation in a mediation. But that's something that starts from the beginning of the client relationship, and it should continue. It's not just transaction, okay, we're going in to file this complaint. Okay, now we're going to depose these witnesses. Okay, now we're going to file this motion practice. It's really getting an understanding day to day on what the company is doing, how the company is doing, and frankly, how this particular matter impacts their business. That's crucial to understanding what they need and how they may be thinking from a business perspective to help you set those goals that I started talking about with on step one.
Right. Now, you and I both live in Los Angeles, Amber, and if we decided we wanted to get together for a conversation, we could find local coffee shop or coffee joint, and we could figure out a way to get together. You're now representing clients as head of the insurance practice. You must have clients all over the country, if not all over the world, and you're dealing with them increasingly online through online platforms. The way we're talking today, we're not in the same physical place, even though we're in the same city. So what tips do you have on how to do that where you may be many time zones or even a different continent away and not able to sit across the table at a coffee shop or restaurant with a client?
That question is something I think every practitioner and every law firm across the country pretty much since COVID, more and more. I have the benefit of having been at a law firm that has a global footprint for some time to have that practice. I remember when I first came over to Reed Smith back in 2011, on day one, I was working with clients and colleagues across the country and across the world. So I've had some, call it historical experience of being able to work closely with folks without actually being in the same room. That said, there still is nothing like being able to, as you said, share a cup of coffee, having a lunch, or just doing a check-in. And it's important to the extent now that travel is back, for example. If I'm in a city on business in another matter, or even if I'm happen to be in the city for a personal matter that I know I have a client in, I try to let that client know, hey, I'm going to be in, call it New York or DC or Chicago or wherever it may be. Would love to catch up if you have the time. And in those meetings, it goes back to the prior conversation that we were just having. It's like, that's where I'm spending time getting to know my clients better, getting to understand them as human beings and as individuals, trying to find some common ground with them outside of the case. Sure, we may talk shop, because that's part of what we do, but it's just, again, trying to establish relationships with our clients. I think we have to be sensitive to what our clients' needs are. There are some clients now, especially at this in this juncture, that don't want to see you. They're like, hey, I have learned how to work this hybrid thing or this remote thing, and I'm good. No, I'm fine. That's totally okay as well. And so it's always about playing with your audience and making sure that you're still making those touch points, even if you're doing it on Zoom. Turn your camera on. That's one thing that we can all do easily. There's nothing worse than trying to have a relationship conversation with a black screen with your name on it. Turn your camera on. It's easy. It's okay. Comb your hair real quick, throw on a nice shirt, you'll be fine. And just have that conversation. It's not that hard. If anything, being able to connect has gotten easier. We just have to make sure that we are doing our part to make the connections and doing it in a meaningful way.
Do you find it's a generational issue as well?
Sometimes it can be. I think that it is definitely when we came back post-COVID, and prior to taking on this role, I was the managing partner of the Los Angeles office. And when I came in that role, right after in the year that we were reopening post-COVID, and I had a roster where 2/3 of my associates in my office were what I call in that COVID generation. They went to law school online. They had not worked in person in a job because all their summer programs were all remote. And so you had to work through this idea of trying to teach someone how to interact in person when they had never had to do that in a professional setting before. So I do think that there is some portion of our population as lawyers that is still learning how to transition into that. And there are some of us who knew how to do it, but when we got home, we got real comfortable with being home. And so asking them to be back in person again is like, well, do I really want to go back to that? So I think it's a mixture of both. I think the idea, though, is to understand where everybody is, meet them halfway, understand, especially when you're talking about clients, understand what their expectations are and do it. That's part of customer service, who we are as practitioners. And then also just understanding where you are too, and what works for you is important. There are ways to make this flexible. And if anything, COVID has taught us is that we can still do it and we can be flexible in how we get it done.
So true. Let's go back to some mundane topics. Showing the receipts, which you've mentioned several times, putting flesh on the bones, meat on the bones, showing that you're not just throwing numbers around in a mediation, that you really have basis for them. Let's talk about the timing of that and the mediation briefs, because sometimes I deal with lawyers who have their receipts, but are very reluctant to share that information with insurance carriers before the mediation. I get these mediation briefs that are stamped confidential. Sometimes I understand why they're stamped confidential, and sometimes it's harder to understand why. And I think to myself, if the policyholders want this information to make an impact on the insurance carriers, it's not going to happen if the information just resides in the brain of the mediator. What's your approach to sharing this information, showing the receipts before the mediation, perhaps giving the insurance carriers time to assimilate that information and sometimes come to the mediation with more money in tow? What's your view?
I think it depends. I have been in situations on both sides of that. I have been in mediations where I have prepared full spreadsheets to carriers ahead of the mediation. And I have also been in a situation where I'm like, look, we've had a claims process prior to litigation. You know what the numbers are. So there's a little bit of that going on. I think it also depends on what your goals are. If your goal is coming into this mediation wanting to settle, there's more appetite for sharing of information. If it's just information gathering, or we have been kind of so far apart and it's really about getting close, I think that appetite is lessened a little bit. There's always the concern, I think, from a policyholder lawyer that, are the insurers really here to play ball? Or are they just information gathering? And I would say that that's probably a lot of what drives this idea of being confidential. The way I look at it is oftentimes, and I mark briefs confidential pretty regularly, unless a mediator tells me that I can't and we have to share it. And from that perspective, I think from my audience at that point is the mediator. Because if the mediator can believe in my story, my client's story, their damages, the receipts, then it's better coming from the mediator to go and take that information and have a conversations with the carriers. Oftentimes, if I'm the one that's delivering that message, I think that there is an immediate wall that comes up where, the carriers are looking at me as the adversary. And it's like, well, I don't want to hear anything. She has to stay. I know that that's what their position is, but that doesn't mean it's correct. And from that case, you get yourself back into that litigation mode as opposed to the mediation mode. And so when I come in and I do a confidential conversation or a confidential brief, it's because I want to be able to tell the mediator what our position is. And if the mediator says, hey, look, I'm not buying this, then that's information that's helpful for me to take back to the clients to be able to adjust. If, on the other hand, the mediator looks at my receipts and says, yeah, you got something there, let me go talk to the other side, then I'm feeling in a much better place because I'm not the only one that's saying that our position has some teeth to it.
And at that point, does not the mediator still have to be able to show the receipts to the insurance carrier? The insurance carrier is always going to say, well, it's very nice that you say so, Mr. or Miss Mediator. Now, where's the beef?
Even if I share information with a mediator, I would say 8 times out of 10, I don't have any problem with the mediator then taking that information and going over there. They'll always ask, hey, can I share this with the insurers? And like I said, 8 times out of 10, I'm saying yes, because the question itself from the mediator asking me if they can take this information and go to the other room and talk to my adversary about it means that there's something about whatever that is that the mediator resonates with. And they may be in a position to be able to tell that story better than I can. Now, look, we all know no one is required to settle at a mediation. And there is no guarantee that at the end of the day that you're going to reach a resolution. But again, sometimes the goal of that mediation is just to get a little bit closer. Sometimes it's just about getting information. And if I don't have to be the conduit of that information, but someone else is knocking on the other side's door, that's not a bad thing. That's still a success.
So when you're looking for information, what kind of information are you typically seeking from an insurance carrier?
Besides them to open up their checkbook and write money with commas and zeros?
The purposes of the mediation can be to gather information. An insurance carrier might say, well, we're there to gather more information about the claim. We're there to see the receipts. From the policyholder perspective, when you're there to gather more information, what are some things that you commonly have in mind?
Sure. So from the policyholder perspective, remember, when we're talking about a litigation, we're not just filing a lawsuit out of thin air. There is a claims process that precedes adversarial litigation. And usually by the time I'm brought in, not all the time, but by the time I'm brought in, some parts of the claim process has already occurred. And I'm called because the insurers are not paying or suggesting that they're not going to pay. They've denied the claim, whatever it may be. So from our perspective, insurance company has had the opportunity and they're obligated to investigate the claim under the statutes and the regulations. And so that part, they have that information with respect to the claim. From a policyholder perspective, the information that I'm trying to gather might be, for example, if they say there's no coverage, they have defenses to coverage, there's an exclusion that applies, or whatever the case may be, I need to understand why you believe that. because it may be up until that point, all I have is one paragraph that says the exclusion under section 8.2 little a applies, and there may not necessarily be the receipts for that exclusion. The other piece of information that I'm trying to understand is whether the insurers feel that they are ready to negotiate today. Sometimes, oftentimes, especially if you're having mediations early in the litigation, the insurance companies are not ready. And a lot of messaging is told through the numbers that they offer or put on the table. And if that's the case, that's fine. That's information that we gather and we take it back. Sometimes it is, to your point, Jeff, where insurance company says, well, I don't have enough information for me to be able to evaluate the claim or for me to be able to demonstrate that this is something that can be settled. Well, so then my question is, what information do you feel you need? Oftentimes I can give them that information in the mediation because I've done my homework. I've prepared. And if that's the case, I want to be in a position to be able to exhaust every question that an insurer has in that mediation. Because then I know if it's really that they're missing information or if that's just a soundbite that they want to give me because they're not ready to settle. So that's the type of information that I'm trying to understand from an insurance company through the course of mediation. And then we can go from there. And then you go back to that step number 5 of close the deal or walk away.
So let's wrap it up. We're almost out of time, Amber. Let's talk a little bit about coordination and preparation with mediators. You mentioned, and we've discussed several times, there can be different goals for the mediation. Close the deal, get closer, gather information, other possible goals as well. What do you do to let the mediator know in advance what your particular goal might be and to make sure that the mediator is preparing to help you achieve the specific goal you have for that mediation that day?
So sometimes I won't share that information in advance. Sometimes that information is learned and determined and shared in the middle of the mediation or even at the end. Because a lot of times we're still trying to understand. I think each side is really trying to understand where the other side is. And so it may be there's a point in a mediation where it's, all right, we can close this deal, but not unless the parties get aligned at XYZ. That may come at 4 o'clock, 5 o'clock that afternoon. And it's at that point that I'm able to share that information with the mediator. I always go in and tell the mediator, here's where we are, here's where the numbers are or have been any settlement discussions we've previously had, so that they are at least armed with where we are in the negotiations process. And even sometimes that's enough for the mediator to know, all right, maybe I got a shot today, or this is going to be a long day. And so I think my goal is to understand and work with the mediator as a partner, but at the same time, understanding when, if this is a case that may not settle today, that's not necessarily something I will know at the beginning of the case to be able to share with the mediator. That's something you might find out throughout the course of the day.
Fair enough. And final question, Amber, you talked about sometimes knowing before lunchtime whether a case is going to settle and sometimes just saying, well, not going to happen today. A common criticism of mediators is when mediators say something like that, oh, you guys are just too far apart, we're never going to settle, send you home before lunchtime. What insights can you give about when you really know when you really know for certainty that something's not going to settle that day, and when you might just say, you know what, they're being stubborn because it's their nature. It's 11 o'clock, it's 12 o'clock, it's lunchtime, it's 2 in the afternoon. Let's let it marinate and see if 5 o'clock lightning strikes again. How do you distinguish between those kinds of situations?
In those situations, it's usually I know where my client is, and I would expect the same to be in the other room. If my client wants to settle that day, I know that there is an opportunity to settle that day. And that is something that if the mediator comes back and says, hey, you're too far apart, we're not going to get this done, where the conversation that I have with the mediator is precisely that. Actually, Mr. or Mrs. Mediator, I think this can settle today. And then perhaps the mediator might try to tease that out a bit and see if the other side thinks that it might settle today. But similarly, if the mediator just doesn't think it's going to happen for whatever reason, because the carriers are not there, or because they're using a process that doesn't allow that information to be exchanged, I can still negotiate. I don't stop negotiating simply because my mediation is over. And that's what I think is important to remember and kind of keep in your back pocket.
Yes, the negotiation keeps going until the case settles or is finally adjudicated by the highest court that's ever going to take a look at it. I agree. Amber, this conversation is fantastic and we could go on a lot longer. We're out of time, though. I want to thank you so much for a wonderful, sophisticated, high-level conversation about your views on the mediation process. I hope that people who are watching this webinar, if they're in a position to do so, contribute in your honor to the Los Angeles Regional Foodbank or any other food bank in their area or one that is important to them. Amber Finch, thank you so much. And with that, we are complete.